The sinking of the luxury cruise liner Lusitania by a German U-boat in 1915 was the incident that played a major part in drawing the United States into the First World War. There were many warnings of German U-boats plaguing civilian shipping in the waters around the UK, and the German embassy had even placed an ad in several New York newspapers right next to advertising for the Lusitania sailings, advising that Americans travelling on British or Allied ships in war zones did so at their own risk. Both Cunard, the owners, and passengers did not take the notices seriously. Everybody dismissed the warnings as wartime propaganda, thinking that the Lusitania, which was captained by William Turner, was too big and too fast for any German submarine to attack, and also that no submarine commander would attack the ship because the rules of naval warfare outlawed attacks on civil passenger shipping. But Lusitania was also carrying a cargo of munitions for the British war effort, a secret not known publicly, but which had not escaped the Germans, probably because the British wanted them to know. At this time, British intelligence had the ability to tap into U-boat communications, so when German submarine U-20, captained by Walter Schwager, gave a progress report in April, the Admiralty knew that it was on its way. Months later, they also knew that the German U-boat was in the waters where the Lusitania would be sailing, and in the 2 days prior to the attack, 3 merchant ships had been sunk in the waters between Ireland and England, confirming the U-boat was active, but they did not warn Captain Turner, nor did they send the promised destroyer as an escort. At this point, Lusitania's voyage had gone without incident, but on May 7, 1915, only a few hours out from docking, the forward part of the ship beneath the wheelhouse was struck by a torpedo from the German submarine U-20. Later, Captain Schwager recorded the entire incident in his logbook, detailing the firing right down to the angle they were on and that only one torpedo had been used. This strike in turn led to a second explosion, which was the fatal blow from which the ship sank within 18 minutes. Within days, again the British had intercepted a message from Schwager to the German command during the U-20's return voyage, saying that they had sunk the Lusitania with a single torpedo. This intercept was suppressed. There is no direct proof that the ship was sacrificed, but the circumstances surrounding events that led to the sinking strongly indicate that the attack was deliberately allowed to happen. It was also no secret that Churchill wanted as many American ships sunk by the Germans as possible in order to draw the Americans into the war. This fact is documented in a memo he wrote in February 1915. Quote, "It's most important to attract neutral shipping to our shores with hope of embroiling the US with Germany. We want the traffic, the more the better, and if some of it gets into trouble, the better still." End quote. Because there were a number of survivors, the second explosion had to be explained. It is well documented that the Lusitania was carrying 173 tons of war munitions, which was not the knowledge of the travelling public, but at the time was thought by the Admiralty to have been the cause of the second explosion. To agree with what actually happened would mean that both the British and the US would have to accept some culpability, and any propaganda would have less effect in raising the ire of the American public, plus it was a bad look, and a violation of the internationally recognised cruiser rules that the Lusitania had a cargo of war munitions in the first place, which had in effect made it a legitimate military target. To get round the problem, US and British authorities insisted the ship was hit by 2 torpedoes, not 1, to explain the 2 explosions, which was inevitably the verdict of a later inquiry and investigation. Subsequent and recent investigations with modern methods have now proved that the second explosion was not caused by the munitions, but by cold water coming into contact with the hot boilers. While the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife are accredited by mainstream history as the event that was the catalyst for the beginning of World War I, there were many other factions which also contributed. In fact, that shooting on the 28th of June 1914 in Sarajevo was but only a small piece of the puzzle. There is strong evidence of a conspiracy within the wealthy elite of Britain at the time, who engineered political situations to their own advantage. This secret group was known as the Rhodes Round Table, and also later as the Milner Group. This group, which later revealed themselves under the guise advocating for world peace, not only wanted to gain a stronger foothold in Europe by eradicating Germany, who they saw as a rising threat to their economic interests, but they also wanted to reunite America back into the British Empire. In conjunction, many wealthy American elite became embroiled with the same ideals, while many other co-conspirators were simply in it for the money. But these people all conspired in the background to have Woodrow Wilson elected in 1916, where they knew their influence would bring America's much needed aid into the war in Europe, which is exactly what happened a year later. Also, these American wealthy elite, the Carnegies, the Rockefellers and the Morgans, had invested heavily with millions of dollars of loans to the British and eventually the US war efforts, where they stood to make millions more in return, but only if the Allies won. So hence the need for the US to join the war in Europe to ensure victory. Close confidant to President Wilson and master string puller Edward Mandell House, or Colonel House, was also closely tied to the Milner Group, whose real agenda was to unite the globe under one British rule government. For more details on this, see James Corbett's The World War I Conspiracy series, available free on YouTube. In this clip, from the second in James's World War I series, the skullduggery of House can be realised, and it also offers further proof that the British authorities were fully aware the Lusitania would in all likelihood be attacked.
May 7th, 1915. Colonel Edward Mandell House is on his way to meet with King George V, who ascended to the throne after Edward VII's death in 1910. Accompanying him is Edward Grey, British Foreign Secretary and acolyte of the Milner Group. The two speak of the probability of an ocean liner being sunk, and House informs Grey that, if this were done, a flame of indignation would sweep across America, which would in itself probably carry us into the war. An hour later, at Buckingham Palace, King George V inquires about an even more specific event. We fell to talking, strangely enough, of the probability of Germany sinking a transatlantic liner. He said, suppose they should sink the Lusitania with American passengers on board. And, by a remarkable coincidence, at 2 o'clock that afternoon, just hours after these conversations took place, that is precisely what happened. And, most remarkably of all, by Edward Mandell House's own account, both Edward Grey and King George V himself were discussing the sinking of the Lusitania just hours before the event took place.
Before the Americans had joined the war, and while the German army was advancing through Belgium to overthrow France, many German atrocities toward Belgian civilians were reported. The American propaganda machine stepped up tenfold, exaggerating the reports tremendously in a campaign that became known as Babies on Bayonets, in order to vilify Germany and gain public support for the US to enter into the war. And along with the outrage caused by the sinking of the Lusitania, the inevitable happened on April 6, 1917. There can be no doubt that the Lusitania was sacrificed as part of a campaign to draw the US into the war. And even though they would not do so for another 2 years, when they do, the American soldiers vow to avenge the 1,195 men, women and children who perished when the Lusitania sank.